What if the perfect love story was hiding a secret all along? Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happens. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The day of the funeral felt like the kind of cold John Cena had never faced before. He had walked into arenas packed with thousands of roaring fans, had stood in front of cameras under blinding lights, had taken punches, body slams, and chants of hatred from crowds who wanted to see him broken. But nothing compared to this silence, the silence of a cemetery in winter, where the only sound was the shuffle of shoes on gravel and the low voice of a pastor reciting words that felt both too distant and too final. John stood rigid at the edge of the grave, the black of his suit contrasting against his broad frame, his famous face drawn and hollow. In his hand, the shovel's wooden handle felt heavier than any championship belt he had ever lifted. He had thrown dirt in victory countless times inside a wrestling ring, but now, as the soil scattered over the gleaming casket that held his wife, Elizabeth, the weight threatened to crush him. Beside him, his young daughter gripped his massive hand with both of hers. She didn't fully understand what was happening, not yet. Her small voice had whispered to him earlier, "Daddy, when is Mommy coming home?" And he had swallowed the ache in his chest, unable to answer in a way she would truly understand. She stood in her little coat, eyes wide, sensing only that the world she knew had shifted, that something she couldn't name had been stolen from her forever. The cemetery wind bit hard, tugging at coats and scarves, rattling wreaths of flowers laid lovingly at the foot of the grave. The trees around them stood bare, branches like skeletal arms clawing at a gray sky. John's breath came out in visible bursts, steady but heavy. He tried to keep himself composed for his daughter's sake, but inside he felt like he was unraveling. Elizabeth had been the anchor of his life. People saw him as the unshakable one, John Cena, the wrestler, the Hollywood star, the tough man who stood tall against anything. But at home, it had been her steady laugh that filled the silence, her voice that calmed his restless nights, her presence that softened the edges of his life. Without her, their house was no longer a home. Without her, he wasn't sure who he was outside the ring and outside the cameras. Friends and neighbors filed past him after the burial, offering their condolences in hushed tones. They brought casseroles wrapped in foil, pies boxed up, food meant to comfort a man who had no appetite. They said the usual things. She was an angel. She's at peace now. Time will heal this wound. John nodded out of politeness, but their words slid past him like smoke. None of them reached the center of his grief. None of them understood what had been lost. To everyone else, Elizabeth was the perfect woman. She was known for her kindness at church gatherings, her tireless efforts at local charities, the way she carried herself with quiet grace. People admired her pale hair, her soft smile, her delicate composure beside John's towering frame. They saw the two of them together as a storybook pairing, the world-famous wrestler turned actor, and the woman who seemed almost angelic, a partner who completed him. They marveled at how their love seemed to transcend every barrier. But John had seen something no one else noticed. He had caught fleeting expressions on her face when she thought no one was watching, shadows in her eyes, moments where her smile slipped and something heavier surfaced. At the time, he had brushed it aside as stress or exhaustion. Now, standing at her grave, the memory of those looks haunted him. They weren't simple moods. They had been glimpses of something deeper, something unspoken. The day passed in a haze. After the last mourner left, John drove home with his daughter in silence. The house they returned to felt unbearable without Elizabeth. Her sweater still lay draped over the arm of the chair. Her books lined the shelves in perfect order. The faint trace of her perfume lingered in their bedroom. Every corner of the house reminded him of her presence and her absence. That night, after tucking his daughter into bed, John sat alone in the living room with only a single lamp casting a circle of light. The casserole sat untouched on the counter, cooling as the minutes passed. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling, but the silence pressed against him until he thought he might break. His daughter's questions echoed in his head. "When is Mommy coming home?" she had whispered, eyes wide with confusion. John had tried to explain gently, but the words caught in his throat. How do you explain permanence to a child? How do you tell her that the woman who kissed her good night every evening would never walk through the door again? He promised himself he would protect his daughter, that he would be strong for her even if he no longer knew how. But in the quiet moments, when the house seemed to shrink around him, the weight of Elizabeth's absence became unbearable. The community saw him as resilient. The fans still saw him as a hero. But in the private space of his living room, John Cena was just a man broken by loss, and deep inside that grief, another feeling stirred, something harder to name: unease. The sense that there were pieces of Elizabeth's life he had never been allowed to see, corners of her story that remained in shadow. He replayed small moments in his mind. How she avoided questions about her childhood, how she brushed off conversations about family, how she sometimes stiffened at the sight of a police car or turned her gaze when certain topics came up. He had told himself then that love meant not pressing too hard, not forcing her to revisit pain she didn't want to share. But now, after the coffin was lowered and the final words were spoken, the thought clawed at him relentlessly. How much did I really know about the woman I married? John leaned back in his chair, the lamplight throwing shadows across the room. The silence of grief was crushing, but beneath it lay something else, a silence filled with secrets, the kind of silence that waits to be broken. And though he didn't yet know it, that silence would soon lead him up the attic stairs, to a discovery that would change his life forever. Nights became John's greatest enemy. During the day, he could keep himself busy, answering phone calls from well-meaning friends, making sure his daughter ate at least half of her meals, forcing himself to smile when neighbors dropped by with kind words that barely touched his heart. But when the house grew quiet, when the lights dimmed and his daughter fell asleep, the silence wrapped around him like chains. He would sit on the couch, staring at the lamp casting its narrow glow, surrounded by Elizabeth's presence in every detail. The sweater still draped over the arm of the chair, the faint trace of her perfume lingering on their bed, the books she had neatly arranged on the shelves. It should have been comforting, but instead it felt suffocating. He was living inside a museum dedicated to her absence. And that was when the memories began to press harder. He started recalling all the little things that had once seemed unimportant. The times Elizabeth brushed off his questions about her childhood with a quick smile. The way she would stiffen when he mentioned family gatherings or reunions. The sharp change of subject whenever he asked about where she had gone to school. He had loved her enough not to press further, to take her silence as a boundary he shouldn't cross. But now, with her gone, that silence felt more like a wall she had built to keep him out. There was one memory that grew louder with each passing night: the attic. Elizabeth had always spent more time up there than he realized. Sometimes, when he came home early from a shoot or from the gym, he would hear her footsteps above him. She would emerge, hours later, eyes rimmed red, brushing at the dust on her sleeves. When he asked what she was doing, she always gave vague answers, sorting through old books, cleaning boxes, just keeping things in order. He believed her. He wanted to believe her. But now, when he thought back on it, something felt wrong. Dust alone couldn't explain the redness in her eyes. And if she was simply sorting through old belongings, why had she locked the attic door behind her so often? The thought gnawed at him. One evening, after putting his daughter to bed, John stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The cord dangled from the ceiling, the old ladder folded up waiting. His chest tightened as he stared at it. The house was so quiet he could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his own weight. He gripped the railing, his hand trembling despite his size and strength. He could almost imagine Elizabeth's presence lingering there, urging him forward and warning him back at the same time. With a deep breath, he reached up and pulled the cord. The ladder unfolded with a groan, each hinge squealing as though it hadn't been moved in years. A rush of cold, dusty air spilled down, filling the hallway with the smell of wood and forgotten things. He stared up into the darkness above, his heart pounding louder than it ever had before a fight in the ring. He climbed a few steps, the ladder creaked under his weight. His shoulders brushed against the walls of the narrow passage. He paused halfway, his breath caught in his throat. The silence above pressed down on him, thick and unyielding. For a moment, John Cena, the man who had faced giants in arenas, the man who had been cheered and booed by millions, felt something he wasn't used to admitting. Fear, not of what was up there, but of what it might mean. He stood frozen, the attic yawning open above him like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. He imagined Elizabeth's voice in the dark, whispering, "Not yet. Don't look. Don't break the silence I left behind." With a sharp breath, he stepped back down, retreating into the hallway. His hands shook as he folded the ladder up again and let it click back into place. The cord dangled silently, mocking him. He wasn't ready. Not yet. That night, he sat in the living room until dawn, staring at the ceiling above him, his thoughts circling the unanswered questions. He replayed every time Elizabeth had mentioned the attic, every vague excuse she had given, each memory twisted into something darker, something heavier. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling never left. Every time he passed the stairway, his eyes lingered. Every time he tucked his daughter into bed, he found himself listening to the silence above, waiting for footsteps that would never come again. Elizabeth had carried something into that attic, and whatever it was, she had locked it away. Now, in her absence, the silence itself felt alive, whispering to him, pulling at him, daring him to climb those stairs again. And though he had turned away once, John knew the day would come when he could no longer resist. The house was silent when John finally gave in. His daughter was spending the night at a neighbor's, and for the first time in weeks he was truly alone. The loneliness pressed harder than ever. He paced the kitchen floor, glancing again and again at the ceiling above, the place where the unanswered questions waited. He knew he could not keep circling forever. The attic had become a wound in the house, a wound in his heart, and tonight he would open it. He pulled the cord. The ladder groaned as it unfolded, wood and metal squeaking like it resented being disturbed. A burst of dry, cold air rolled down over him, smelling of dust and forgotten things. His massive hands gripped the ladder, and slowly, step by step, he climbed into the dark. The attic greeted him with silence. A round window admitted only a pale sliver of moonlight, enough to make the dust shimmer as it swirled in the air. The bulb, hanging from the ceiling, flickered weakly when he pulled the cord, filling the room with a yellow glow that barely reached the corners. Boxes were stacked against the walls. Old trunks sat heavy with time. The space felt ordinary, and yet John's chest tightened as if he had stepped onto forbidden ground. He felt her there. Elizabeth, her presence lingering among the forgotten furniture and sagging boxes. He began moving things aside, one at a time. Toys long outgrown, dresses folded and stored, books with pages curling at the edges. Harmless things, but each one left him unsettled, as if every item whispered that something larger was waiting just ahead. And then he saw it. In the far corner, half hidden beneath a collapsed cardboard box, lay a dark leather briefcase. Its surface was scuffed, worn with age, dust piled thick across it. But what froze John were the faint initials pressed into the leather. They weren't Elizabeth's. They weren't anyone's, he recognized. For a long moment, he stood still, staring. His heart pounded in his chest like it had before championship fights, but this was different. In the ring, he had always known what waited: an opponent, a crowd, a fight. Here, the enemy was silence, and the unknown pressed harder than any fist. He knelt, his knees creaking against the wooden floorboards. His hand hovered over the handle. He could almost hear Elizabeth's voice behind him, warning him back, "Don't open it, don't look." But the silence was stronger, dragging him forward. The case was heavier than he expected when he pulled it closer. The clasps were stiff with age, resisting his grip. He pressed harder, and with a sharp metallic snap, the first one released. The second followed with a reluctant click that echoed through the confined attic like a gunshot. For a moment, John sat frozen, staring at the closed lid, afraid of what waited inside. He had faced down the biggest names in wrestling, had looked into the eyes of men who wanted to break him, but never had his hands trembled like this. Then, with a steadying breath, he lifted the lid. A wave of stale air escaped, thick with the smell of paper and leather left untouched for decades. Inside, beneath a folded piece of fabric, lay a neat stack of documents, photographs, and envelopes. They looked preserved, as if they had been placed there with great care. John's hand shook as he picked up the first photograph. His chest tightened. It was Elizabeth, or rather a younger version of her, a girl of maybe 16 or 17, standing in front of a farmhouse. Same pale hair, same unmistakable features, but her eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking away, as if already searching for escape. Beneath the photo lay identification cards. One by one, he flipped through them. Each bore her face, but with different names, different birth years, different towns. Some placed her in Pennsylvania, others in Arizona, others still in places John had never heard her mention. With every card he uncovered, the woman he thought he had known dissolved further, her identity slipping away like smoke. His breathing grew heavier. His knuckles tightened around the edges of the cards. The truth pressed against him like a weight. His wife had lived under false names, not once, not twice, again and again. Then came the letters. The paper was yellowed, fragile, the handwriting frantic. The words spilled across the page with desperation. Fear of being trapped in a house, of someone watching her every move, a man, a stepfather, and another figure named R, someone who promised to help her escape. Another letter raged with anger, betrayal, pain, and a vow to never return to the place she had left. John's throat tightened as he read. These weren't the calm, gentle words of the woman who had been his wife. They were the words of someone terrified, someone who had lived in shadows. At the bottom of the case lay a folded newspaper clipping. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The headline hit him like a punch to the chest. Teenage girl vanishes. Anna McPhersonson, age 17. The photo beside it made the room spin. It was her, Elizabeth, his wife. But not Elizabeth, Anna. The article described her disappearance one summer night, leaving behind confusion and unanswered questions. John dropped into silence, the clipping trembling in his hands. His breath came heavy, ragged, the woman he had buried, the woman he had trusted, the mother of his child. She wasn't who she claimed to be. His grief twisted into something new, something darker: betrayal. He placed the letters back carefully, his fingers trembling, his mind a storm. Closing the case didn't close what it had opened. Questions pounded in his head, relentless. Who was Anna? Who was Elizabeth? What had she been running from all these years? John Cena, the man who had stood unbroken in front of millions, now felt hollow. His wife's secrets had risen from the grave, and they demanded answers. He carried the briefcase down from the attic, each step heavier than the last. The silence of the house no longer felt like grief. It felt like conspiracy. He placed the case on the kitchen table, the lamplight glinting off the scuffed leather. It sat there like an intruder, its presence too large for the room, too heavy for his heart. For the first time, John realized that the story of his marriage wasn't what he thought it was. Elizabeth, Anna, had lived two lives, one with him, one buried in shadows. And now those shadows had come for him. John sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the briefcase lying open before him like a wound he couldn't close, the documents, the photographs, the letters, all scattered across the wood like shards of broken glass. He had memorized them already, every name, every detail, every trembling word, but he kept returning to them as if staring hard enough might finally stitch the fragments into one coherent picture. Sleep no longer existed for him. The house grew colder, darker, and more hostile with every passing day. Even when he managed to close his eyes, the image of that newspaper clipping blazed in his mind. The young face of his wife under the name Anna McPhersonson, declared missing decades ago. It was as though the woman he had buried had risen again, but as a stranger. He couldn't let it rest, not when the truth pressed down on him like this. The next morning, after dropping his daughter off at school, John drove into the city. He found himself in the quiet back room of a public library, hunched over a roll of microfilm. The hum of the machine filled the silence as old headlines flickered past his eyes. His massive frame looked out of place there, the same hands that had once gripped championship belts now fumbling through delicate pages of history. And then he saw it. The same photograph from the clipping in the briefcase. The caption, Anna McPhersonson, 17, disappeared without a trace. The article described a desperate search, a family torn apart, a stepfather claiming she had run away. Her mother had pleaded publicly, begging for her daughter's return, but the trail had gone cold. John's pulse hammered. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was Elizabeth. His Elizabeth. She hadn't been born Elizabeth at all. She had been Anna, a vanished girl who had rebuilt herself under another name. The discovery only tightened the knot in his chest. Why had she never told him? Why had she buried this so deeply that not even the man who had shared her bed, her home, her life, had been allowed inside? He dug deeper. Hours turned into days. He haunted archives, courthouse basements, dusty historical societies where the air smelled of mildew and old paper. He copied articles, scribbled notes until his hand cramped, drove long hours to small towns that seemed barely changed since the 1980s. Piece by piece, the story grew darker. He found whispers of a family trapped in silence. Neighbors remembered Anna's stepfather, a man with a reputation for control, a temper that sparked fear. They spoke of arguments behind closed doors, of strange silences that seemed to settle over the farmhouse at night. Some recalled the girl herself, quiet, polite, but always with shadowed eyes, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear. Then came the rumors of the stepfather's sudden death. Official reports called it an accident, a fall down the stairs, but no one really believed it. Some whispered that he had been drunk, careless. Others said Anna had pushed him. And when she vanished soon after, suspicion hardened. John listened to these accounts with a tightening chest. Each new detail was a knife, carving away the woman he thought he knew. Elizabeth, gentle and warm, had carried this darkness in her bones. He had shared a life with her, a home, a child, and she had kept this buried under layers of silence. But another thought pressed harder. Maybe she hadn't hidden it because of guilt. Maybe she had hidden it because of fear. The letters in the briefcase made more sense now. The frantic handwriting, the desperate pleas to someone named R for escape, the anger, the terror, the vow never to return. They weren't lies. They were the voice of a girl trying to survive, and yet the shadow of the stepfather's death clung to the story like a stain. Back at home, John spread the documents across the table again, arranging them chronologically, forcing them into order. Identification cards lined up in a grim parade, each with a new name, a new town, a new beginning. Each life lasted only a few years before she shed it, like a snake slipping out of its skin. Until finally, she had become Elizabeth. Until finally, she had become his wife. The pattern was undeniable. Reinvention, concealment, escape. He remembered moments now with piercing clarity. How she stiffened when his mother asked about her family. How her eyes hardened at the sight of a police cruiser. How she sometimes sat alone, staring into nothing, her hands trembling slightly. He had taken those moments as signs of sensitivity, of a gentle heart. Now he saw them for what they were, shadows of a past she couldn't erase. Driving back from another fruitless search one evening, John pulled over at the remains of the old farmhouse. Weeds had claimed the land, the roof sagged, the windows shattered. He stood in the silence, the cold wind cutting across his face, and imagined her there, Anna, trapped, desperate, watching her own life slip through her fingers. He whispered her name into the night. Not Elizabeth, not the woman the world had known, but Anna, the vanished girl, the fugitive, the survivor. The weight of it nearly buckled him. Was she guilty of killing a man? Or was she guilty only of silence, of running, of building a life from ashes? He didn't know. And the not knowing tore at him worse than anything. John Cena, who had faced down every kind of opponent in front of millions, was powerless against the ghost of his wife's past. The briefcase had opened a door he could never close, and now he was caught between two impossible truths. Elizabeth, the woman who had loved him and their daughter with all her heart. Anna, the girl who had vanished, leaving behind death, whispers, and suspicion. The two were one and the same, and he didn't know which one to believe in. The briefcase never left John's sight. Whether it sat open across the kitchen table or locked shut in the corner of the room, it seemed to breathe, filling the house with a weight heavier than any opponent he had ever faced in the ring. Weeks had passed since he had carried it down from the attic, but the storm it had unleashed inside him refused to quiet. Every night, when his daughter was asleep, he spread the contents out again. The yellowed letters, the false identification cards, the photographs curling at the edges. Each piece told fragments of a story that refused to come together. Anna, Elizabeth, fugitive, wife, mother, victim, perhaps even killer. The truth remained buried under contradictions, and John was trapped in the middle, torn between the woman he had loved and the stranger she had been before. His daughter began to notice the change in him. She asked why he always looked tired, why he sometimes seemed far away even when she was right beside him. And one evening, after dinner, she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes and asked the question he had dreaded most. "Daddy, tell me about Mommy." The words pierced him deeper than any chair shot, deeper than any wound the ring had ever given him. He forced a smile, though his chest felt like it might collapse. He told her about Elizabeth's laugh, how she would hum while folding laundry, how she always kissed her daughter's forehead before bed. He painted the image of a gentle, loving mother, because that was true. But as he spoke, the weight of the briefcase burned in the back of his mind, its secrets pressing against every word he said. That night, long after his daughter was asleep, John sat again before the open case. The lamp cast a small circle of light, the rest of the room drowning in shadow. He stared at the newspaper clipping, the headline announcing Anna McPherson's disappearance, the photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like the woman he had buried. He lifted it in his hands, his knuckles white, and whispered into the silence, "Why didn't you trust me?" The question echoed in the empty kitchen, unanswered. John pressed his palms to his face, fighting the anger that tangled with his grief. Had Elizabeth deceived him? Or had she been protecting him? Protecting their daughter? He thought back to the tenderness in her eyes on their wedding day, the tears she shed when their child was born, the countless moments of kindness that had been undeniably real. Those memories clashed violently with the shadows of her past, and he could not reconcile them. He realized then that the truth was not only about her, it was about him. He carried it now. The silence she had lived with had passed to him, and it was his burden to decide what to do with it. He knew one thing. If he told his daughter the truth, it would shatter her memories of her mother. The image of warmth and love would be replaced with suspicion, with questions too heavy for a child to carry, and yet, if he kept it hidden, he would shoulder the weight alone for the rest of his life. The decision gnawed at him relentless. At last, in the small hours of the morning, he rose from the table. He gathered the documents, stacking the photographs, folding the letters, and placed them carefully back inside the briefcase. He closed the lid and pressed the clasps shut. The metallic clicks echoed through the silence, sharp and final. Carrying the case in his hands, he climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, the house seeming to hold its breath as he ascended. At the top, he pulled the cord and unfolded the attic ladder. The bulb overhead buzzed faintly as he pulled the light, filling the space with its dim yellow glow. He walked to the far corner, the same place where he had first discovered the briefcase buried beneath boxes and dust. He knelt, slid it back into the shadows, covered it with old cloth, and placed a trunk before it. It disappeared into the dimness, swallowed once more by silence. John stood there for a long moment, his massive frame still, his chest heavy. He whispered her name softly, Elizabeth, Anna, unsure which one was real, but knowing both belonged to the woman he had loved. His voice trembled as it faded into the attic air. Then he turned off the light and descended the stairs, leaving the past where it belonged. That night, before bed, he stepped quietly into his daughter's room. She slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. He bent low, kissed her forehead, and whispered a promise only she could never fully hear. "You'll remember her for her love. That's all that matters." As he closed the door behind him, John felt something shift inside. The burden was still there, heavy and unyielding, but it no longer threatened to crush him. He had chosen to carry it alone, to protect his daughter from the shadows of a past too dark for innocence. Downstairs, the photograph of Elizabeth smiled from the mantel, her eyes calm and unguarded. John looked at it for a long time, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to smile back. Elizabeth had been many things: child, fugitive, wife, mother, But to him, she had been real. And though the truth would follow him into every tomorrow, he knew he could live with it. The past was buried. The future was his to protect. And the silence, heavy though it was, had finally given him peace. If this story shocked you, share it with your friends and let them feel the suspense too. Subscribe now so you never miss the next twist, and tell us in the comments what you think.